Youth Central has hosted over the past several weeks to condemn racism and promote inclusion and tolerance in each one of our lives. My name is Asha, and I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to the entire Youth Central team, especially Ross and Danny, the Youth Are Awesome blog junior editors, and all of the amazing volunteers and participants for all of their support as we embarked on this adventure. It is now my pleasure to be able to introduce you to a Calgarian, a community builder, and our moderator for tonight's event. Anila Lee Yuen is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Center of Newcomers. Beyond traditional settlement services, Anila has spearheaded programming to include volunteer-led refugee support, Indigenous integration for newcomers, LGBTQ+ support, domestic violence, homeless and mental health support services, and broadened vulnerable youth programming and social venture opportunities. Among her many accolades, Anila has been honored with receiving the University of Calgary Alumni Award and Top 40 Under 40 designation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anila.
Thank you so much, Asha. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Anila. Anila like tequila, not Anila like vanilla, just so you know. And it is my honor to be your moderator for this event. Today we have with us 4 extremely talented high school students from across the city that will be helping us reflect on issues related to equity and justice. So I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. But before we do that, in the spirit of respect and truth, we would like to start off by honoring and acknowledging the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge the members of the Métis community and specifically Métis Region Number 3 that also make Calgary our home. And finally, in the spirit of reconciliation, and because we are all treaty people, we also acknowledge all Calgarians who make our home in the traditional Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. As a person who has parents that are immigrants that chose to come to this country, you know, and working at the Center for Newcomers is so important for us as an agency and as a community to really acknowledge the sacrifices of our Indigenous community and the issues that have led for all of us to hopefully be leading good lives here in Calgary. And while the last couple of months have produced some deeply saddening events in the United States that have quite frankly been quite atrocious, and around the world, including in putting a lot of light to things that are happening in Calgary and in Canada as well, they've also brought to the forefront of our discussions some incredibly important topics and conversations. And as Calgarians, especially here today with a youth focus, with a young people's focus, you know, one of the most important things we can do is reflect on our current climate, look inward towards ourselves and also within our city and our community, and ask ourselves how inclusive we truly are. I, like many of you, love this city. I was born and raised here, and I feel so lucky to be living here today as we experience the craziest year I think that any of us have ever experienced in our lives, or most of us anyways. And with a sense of gratitude also comes a sense of responsibility to this place, our home. And that means, you know, for us to really start thinking about, and with humility, to show integrity, to be honest, and have the real courage and determination that it takes to have uncomfortable conversations that really begin to address some of the needs of our community members and how we really need to change things in a very systemic manner that may have benefited a few, but now really we need to look inwards in terms of how do we benefit everyone and how does everyone prosper. And so with that in mind, we embark on the debate today. And so we would love to hear from all of you throughout tonight's event. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions you may have of our debaters, and we will try our best to address them all in the discussion that we're going to have after the debate section. So the resolution to be discussed this evening is, be it resolved that Calgary is an inclusive city. Representing the proposition side is the first speaker, Henry Yang. Henry is an avid public speaker and writer. He is greatly interested in the humanities and is incredibly excited to be discussing inclusivity in Calgary. The second proposition speaker is Elnaz Henry. Elnaz is a member of the Mayor's Youth Council and co-chair of the TD Youth Earth Ambassadors through Youth Central. Through her involvement in volunteerism, Elnaz aims to activate youth voices and create conversations. They look like they're going to be a real force to be reckoned with on the proposition side. I am really looking forward to hearing what both of them have to say. But they shouldn't get too comfortable, because representing the opposition is the first speaker is Ronica Lee. One of Ronica's passions is creating inclusive opportunities for students, especially in the humanities. She looks forward to starting a conversation about how Calgary can become a better, more inclusive city. And the second opposition speaker is Alazne. Alazne Kesser is interested in using her voice to spread awareness on various political and social issues affecting humanity. She believes that debates like these can help foster critical thinking and push the wheels of change forward. So I think we are going to be having a really great time. For all of us that get to be more of the spectators, it's really going to be entertaining. I'm sure all four of you have a little bit of butterflies and are starting to think about what you're already going to say and wanting to get ready. So, I wish you all luck in that. In this debate, each speaker will deliver a 5-minute constructive speech. The first speaker of each team will also get a 3-minute rebuttal and summary speech. Points of information are when a member of the opposite team interjects a speech and will be allowed during the constructive speeches only, but not during the first and last minute of the speeches. So our timekeepers, Donel or Asha, will clap their hands, so it'll kind of sound like that, okay, after the first minute of each speech, and again with 1 minute remaining to signal the time in which points of information may be raised. With that, I think that we are now ready to begin. And Asha will be doing the timekeeping for us, so I'm really happy about that, and making sure that all of this runs smoothly. I'm just happy to be the moderator and be able to provide some discussion at the end. I now have the pleasure of inviting our first proposition speaker, Henry Yang, to introduce the debate for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So I'll begin now. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. So this is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's not only a really great way to open up the debate today, but also it's really effective in opening up a wider discussion on individuality, expressionism, and above all, the acceptance and tolerance of diversity within what is considered to be an inclusive society. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, because this is an inclusive debate. My name is Henry Yang. I'll be acting as your first speaker on the proposition, and alongside my partner, Elnaz, we speak in support of the motion, be it resolved that Calgary is an inclusive city. Let's begin. All right, so starting off with our model definitions, for the functions of this debate, we're going to assume that an inclusive city refers to one that supports generally progressive ideals on issues such as ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, immigration, etc. And this applies to both the people that make up the city of Calgary as well as the government of Calgary itself. We're also going to be assuming that a society that is progressive/inclusive does not have to be 100% accounted for by its numbers. It's illogical to assume that a city needs to ensure that every single member of its constituency is tolerant, because that degree of inclusion is simply impossible. So as long as a society is majorly supportive of these specific political and social issues, then it's applicable as an inclusive city by our definitions. All right, let's move on to the first point of contention. So I'm going to be proving to you today that the social environment that the youth of Calgary are brought up in ensures that the people of Calgary themselves are inclusive and open-minded individuals. And this point functions on a few different fronts. So firstly, on an education and academic standpoint, much of this can be evidenced by the effort to include inclusivity-based subjects, such as humanities subjects that discuss modern discrimination and systemic oppression throughout history, among many more. I think overall, it's clear that there are efforts within the schools of Calgary and Canada as a whole that seek to better educate students on issues of the past, many of which relate to this lack of inclusivity. A prime example could be like a spotlight that is placed on Indigenous history in Canada, residential schooling, and the continuing fight for Aboriginal rights within the modern age, among many more. I think above all of these lessons, along with the entirety of the school environment, help students better understand the detriments of oppression. Moreover, acceptance, tolerance, as well as collaboration are the more effective method to moving forward collectively as a stronger and inclusive society. It's a logical assumption to make that the majority of citizens within Calgary are inclusive and progressive because of the curriculums in place that encourage inclusivity and diversity. So for example, you have the courses that we just discussed, you have in-school initiatives such as LGBTQ-friendly spaces, you have advocacy clubs and extracurriculars that allow students to discuss a wide variety of global issues, among many more. And these sources of inclusivity and acceptance may seem superficial on the surface. I think it's important to look at the broader overarching mechanism that this point of contention provides, in that things such as an inclusive academic curriculum within schools ultimately set the stage and foundations for what an inclusive community is. When youth, and by extension, just people, look around at the city, at their schools, and find more spaces, safe spaces at that, for a diverse range of people, and an education system that seeks to eliminate racial prejudice and inequality as a whole by starting with their youth through lessons, from a purely logical perspective, this just acts as proof as to how inclusive that society is. And so in the case of this debate, that society refers to Calgary. And this obviously extends to more than just schooling environments. The Calgary Public Library is expanding their children's books collections to include more diverse and inclusive literature. And you have organizations such as the Center for Newcomers that act as an open gateway for immigrants and newcomers to have a healthy integration into Calgarian society. And even more, Canada as a country is one that prides itself on diversity and multiculturalism. And I think the same things can be said about Calgary too. It's counterintuitive to assume that a city like Calgary, where you have approximately 35% of the population being represented by visible minorities, that the city is not inclusive. And even more, there are people, when so many people make up this demographic that should be fighting for ethnic-based discrimination, are not inclusive. It's because of these reasons we think that at the end of the day, at the very least, the population of Calgary is considered inclusive. We think that there is enough evidence to ensure that not only is the population made up of a strong moral value system that very clearly advocates for inclusivity and tolerance and acceptance, but moreover, you have initiatives within the city that uphold these very mandates. And because of this, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. We will now hear from the first speaker of the opposition, Ronica Lee.
All right. While Calgary is certainly a diverse city, diversity is a demographic representation, right? And practices like federally mandated immigration certainly make Canada diverse. There's a distinction here where inclusion is a sense of belonging that has to be intentionally developed at the local level, right? And as opposition, we refute that Calgary is as inclusive as it can be, right? And there are still many strides to be made. So on the opposition case, we're going to talk about we're going to examine the case under three lenses, right? Firstly, we're going to be looking at the economic side. Secondly, the political and legal side. And lastly, my partner will be talking about the social aspect. But first, let's do a little bit of clash. So Henry talks to you about the social environment, right? And the way that we're educating our children. First of all, this only addresses a portion of the population, right? We recognize that youth are important. We recognize that they're going to carry our future, right? And they carry a certain portion of what we're doing now, but it doesn't actually address a majority of Calgary, right? And we need to be looking at a facet that is age inclusive as well, right? We can't be relying on children and the education that they receive to be influencing everything that represents Calgary. And even within that, there are still problems with our education system, right? We've recently seen backlash against a very whitewashed curriculum. Our curriculum doesn't address the contributions of, for example, Black men and women throughout our history, right? And even teachings on Aboriginal sort of history is quite limited, but I'll take your POI.
So seeing as issues like racism and prejudicial behavior are things that require more proactive and precautionary principles and solutions, do you not agree that having education systems in place that specifically target youth in order to ensure that the future generations and leaders of the future society are inclusive are not effective?
Sure, this is a great starting point, but it's not everything that we can be doing, right? There are still many strides that we can make, even within our education systems and beyond that. All right, moving back into the opposition case. Let's start by talking about the economic aspect. When we look at poverty, we see that Calgary has a growing geographic concentration of racialized poverty, where just over half of Aboriginal identifying population in Calgary qualifies as low income, where in 37 communities, anywhere from 60 to well above 80% of low income population is racialized. This is exacerbated by people unofficially establishing neighborhoods of minorities that are linguistically or religiously familiar and comforting, right? But this is actually dangerous because when minorities are sheltered together, they aren't actively being integrated into the mainstream culture, and the perception of these communities is often negative. So think about how the Northeast is often seen as dangerous and is more heavily policed than other communities. Moving on to looking at the workforce, in Canada in general, visible minorities, despite being more educated than the average Canadian, are concentrated in lower level, part-time and temporary jobs. And this is a racialized phenomenon, right? Immigrants from Africa face an unemployment rate that is 4 times that of European immigrants and Canadian-born individuals. And one barrier, right, is that foreign credentials are often not accepted. 2/5 of employers have admitted to screening out applicants with international credentials. Locally, an Alberta Employment and Immigration Survey shows that although 96% of surveyed companies are aware that certain populations are underemployed, only 3% had plans to directly target those underrepresented groups. What we see in Calgary is not an issue of overt discrimination, but rather of glass ceilings and sticky floors. Visible minorities aren't explicitly barred, but they have more hurdles to overcome. On a political and legal aspect, the government doesn't accurately represent the diversity we see in the city, right? So out of 14 city councilors, 3 are women and 2 are visible minorities. Only 17 out of 87 of Alberta's MLAs are visible minorities. And on the other side, there are subtle barriers from participation in the democratic process for certain parts of the population. So for example, for Indigenous voters living on reserves, there are issues with transportation, identification, and with like proof of residence, especially considering that residential homes don't all have unique postal codes, right? And impoverishment, which affects a large portion of Indigenous population, piles onto these struggles. On the legal side, there is not much done to address the effects of institutionalized and systemic racism. So if you look at the Calgary Police Service, Chief Newfield supports largely racialized carding practices, which is asking for identification even when there is no indication of an individual committing a crime. And while bias training exists, studies show that they have little impact on policing practices, which doesn't sufficiently address the issue. Lastly, we see disproportionate incarceration, right? On a federal level, Black and Indigenous people represent 37% of the total prison populace, although they make up less than 9% of the Canadian population. And although this problem has been identified for at least a decade by the Correctional Service of Canada, there's been no change. As a whole, we see subtle but systemic discrimination and few really tangible systems in place to tackle them. We still have a very long ways to go in terms of really incorporating minorities and making Calgary more than just diverse, but truly inclusive.
Thank you very much for that, Ronica, and thank you, Asha, for keeping us on track. That's awesome. So we are now going to invite the second proposition speaker, Elnaz, to deliver her remarks.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Elnaz, and I'll be Side Proposition's second speaker for tonight. My partner Henry already spoke to you about the social environment of Calgary, demonstrating how education plays a major role in advancing inclusivity in our city, and how this work actually extends outside of school curriculums and into public spaces, such as libraries, and how the general population of our city is already fairly inclusive, with 35% of our population being visible minorities. But before we get into our second point of debate, which is city initiatives and municipal policies, I'd like to respond to some of the critiques that we've heard from side opposition proposition. So first of all, side opposition told you that educating our population through improving school curriculums is not at all effective because we're not affecting a large portion of our city's population, which is simply not true. Actually, instead, by educating most of the people either through grades 7 to 12 or the entire from K to 12, you're going to be packing these students that are going to be entering the next generation with the tools and resources that they need to effectively address systemic racism, and you're instead educating an entire generation that will become the future leaders of Calgary. This is a large portion of our population as a city. Side opposition also told you that racialized communities tend to be low income and they're seen as dangerous communities. But in response, side proposition would tell you that these issues can be solved within days or months. And instead, the work necessary starts with immigration services and discounted education services for immigrants that are becoming more and more accessible by the day, and the work is continuing to be expanded and grown. I will take your point at this time. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so according to a poll commissioned by CBC News in 2019, 2/3 of Indigenous people don't feel respected in Canada and say that more could be done. So if the education system is truly as inclusive as you say it is, then why hasn't it been more effective on a larger scale?
So we'll tell you that this issue has been going on for literal centuries, decades and decades and decades. And again, side proposition will remind you that it is impossible to render a city entirely 100% inclusive, and that this work can't be solved within days or months. But as we're going to be talking about in our speech today, there is tons and tons of work being done on the municipal level through initiatives, policies, and motions that are working to address these issues specifically. Now, moving back to side proposition's points, city initiatives are essential for paving the steps towards progress, and they create a foundation for us to learn from and build upon. Not only do we need to understand the importance of visible diversity in our city and the importance of concrete actions taken by a variety of organizations in our city, such as Calgary Pride or the Center for Newcomers as examples, but also the push for systemic progress as catalyzed by the strategies and pieces of legislature introduced and approved and led by the city of Calgary. 3 strategies introduced by the City Council are our focus today: the Gender Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategy, which aims to address the barriers for inclusion and participation for all genders in our city, the more recent anti-racism motion, and the work of the Calgary Aboriginal Urban Affairs Committee, which recommends and advises City Council on ways to continue working towards truth and reconciliation. Now, undoubtedly, the way that a government or authoritative body responds to the concerns of its population on the issues that they're facing says a lot about its drive to solve systemic problems. If you're doubtful as to what these strategies can actually yield for citizens in terms of concrete action, here are some examples of what these motions will be able to accomplish. The anti-racism motion will demand frequent updates on anti-racist action being taken by our police force and a reevaluation of our internal budget systems and policies through a more diverse lens that will serve as a very practical start to addressing structural racism. The gender equity strategy aims to pinpoint and remove the exact barriers that women and minorities face through their journeys to success, and the Calgary Aboriginal Urban Affairs Committee works directly with Indigenous leaders in our city to plan and execute multiple calls to action as they were written out by the Federal Committee for Truth and Reconciliation. These strategies and many more are what have put Calgary ahead of other large cities in terms of inclusivity. Not only are we telling you that Calgary is visibly an incredibly diverse city, but we can also back that up with the work that our government has put in to directly address these issues, our existing concerns, and to have brought us up to this current level of diversity. It's important to keep in mind that these steps towards progress were already created in response to the concerns of citizens. It's entirely possible that even with the full application of these strategies, our population will still demand more action, rightly so, and that factors of structural racism will continue to persist. It's important to remember that as long as we continue our work as a city, either through more concrete legislature, more public initiatives, or better education, we can maintain Calgary's reputation as an inclusive city and continue our work to better our existing progress. So what has side proposition told you this far? We've told you that education and public organizations are key to addressing some of the biggest issues that we have with adults, and that education can actually target our youngest population in Calgary and to give them the tools that they need to address structural racism as they grow into the leaders of tomorrow. I talked to you today about the direct actions that Calgary, the City of Calgary, is pushing through strategies and motions for addressing Indigenous populations, for addressing women and other minorities and racialized minorities to better their situation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elnaz. That was really good. I appreciated your comments. Now on to the second opposition speaker, which is Alazne will now deliver the final constructive speech opposing the case.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Moderator, Ms. Timekeeper, and my most worthy opponents. My name is Alazne and I will carry the case forward for side opposition by first bringing some clash. Second, I will talk about my last constructive argument about the social facet of inclusivity, and I will conclude by summarizing what side op has brought to the table today and why we've won the debate. Before I move directly into some clash, let me take some names. In 2011, Peter Spiewak was a schizophrenic man killed by the police at his family home, even though he had been previously informed about his condition. In 2014, the same officers were cleared of any wrongdoing, and the judge stated that no changes could be implemented to prevent a similar loss of life in the future. In 2013, Lance Cut-Arm of the Cree Nation was fatally shot by the RCMP, even though she was unarmed. In 2018, Jaskamal Singh was killed by the Calgary police while he suffered from a schizophrenic health crisis. And last but not the least, in 2019, Robin Fiddler, a construction worker, mother of 3, and member of the Waterhen Lake First Nation, was also shot by the police and killed. Let us remember these names when we analyze the motion today. So moving into some clash. We did not say that education is not effective, but rather what my partner clearly said is that the education system is not as inclusive as it could be. We learn a very whitewashed version of history without delving into the depth of discrimination and Canada's dark past. Education is truly vital in changing mindsets at grassroots levels, but we need to evaluate exactly how we can make that education more inclusive, diverse, and true to history. So moving into my constructive argument about social facet of inclusivity. Despite a nationwide decrease in police-reported hate crimes across Canada, Alberta actually showed the largest increase in hate crimes since 2018. According to Statistics Canada, in Alberta, hate crimes have increased from 197 in 2017 to 205 in 2018, which is more than any other province in the country. From 2017 to 2018, the number of hate crimes incidents in Calgary have increased from 77 to 80, which is more than Edmonton. And the number of hate crimes specifically targeting the Jewish population in Alberta have more than doubled from 16 incidents in 2017 to 42 in 2018. And according to Statistics Canada, 45 reported hate crimes have been committed against Muslims. But this is only a portion of the hate crimes that actually occur, because research indicates that only approximately 1 in 10 hate-motivated incidents are reported to the police. Many victims don't come forward with their reports on victimization to the police for the fear of retaliation, language or cultural barriers, or a perception that their incident is not as important to talk about. Because let's be clear, that is ultimately what the motion reinforces. It trivializes the microaggressions and incidents of racism that people face. It tells a person like me that my experience walking into a store being stared at or followed around by salespeople because I wear a scarf is not worth reporting, as Calgary overall is an inclusive city. Even the public hearing on systemic discrimination, Shauna Porter, who's a member of the anti-racism group called United Black People Allyship, has compared the hearing to herding in cattle and lumping every single person of color into one group. There are so many ethnic, racial, religious, and other minority groups which each must be given a separate time to speak so that the city can understand each person's unique experience of racism and discrimination. Because ultimately, that's just superficial change. Change is when you provide equal opportunities to people of color as their white counterparts. Change is when the wage gap between Black people and white people is eradicated. Change is when schools actively teach about the history of racism, not this whitewash history that we learn at schools. And I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. The magnitude of residential schools, the severity of discrimination, and the effects it currently has on the people of Indigenous communities, that is change. Change is when justice is served for the victims of police brutality. Change is when people who look like me are not considered other. Change is when you acknowledge that a problem exists and then you seek to improve that situation. That is change. Speaking on forums for 5 minutes about an issue with deep-rooted history and systemic nuances is not change. This resolution proposes that Calgary is a sufficiently inclusive city, which is untrue. We on side opposition definitely acknowledge that Calgary is a welcoming city compared to other cities in Canada or even elsewhere in the world. But other cities are not a parameter for us. They do not justify the marginalization of Indigenous, Black, Muslim, and other minority communities. We have to set our own standard as Calgarians. And we must do better because we can do better, which is why I oppose this motion, so that we accept that Calgary does have an issue and that we work towards evincing real change and become a better city through unity, education, inclusion, representation, and diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alazne. At this time, We will pause for a few minutes to give each team some time to prepare their summary and rebuttal speeches. During this break, we are pleased to be able to share with you the recreation of Prince EA's slam poem, I Am Not Black, You Are Not White, by Youth Central volunteers. Please sit back and enjoy.
It's what the world calls me, but it's not me. I didn't come out of my mother's womb saying, hey everybody, I'm Black. No, I was taught to be Black.
And you were taught to call me that, along with whatever you call yourself. It's just a label.
See, from birth, the world force feeds us these labels, and eventually we all swallow them and we digest and accept the labels, never ever doubting them. But there's one problem. Labels are not you, labels are not me. Labels are just labels. But who we are is not skin deep.
See, when I drive my car, no one would ever confuse the car for me. Well, when I drive my body, why do you confuse me for my body? It's my body. Get it? Not me.
Let me break it down. See, our bodies are just cars we operate and drive around. The dealership we call society decided to label me the Black edition.
George the Irish, our white edition, and with no money down, 0% APR, and no test drive, we were forced to own these cars for the rest of our lives. Forgive me, but I fail to see the logic or pride in defining myself or judging others by the cars that we drive, because who we truly are is found inside.
Listen, I'm not here to tell you how science has concluded that genetically we're all mixed and race in the human species doesn't exist. Or how every historian knows that race was invented in the 15th century to divide people from each other, and it has worked perfectly. No, I'm not here to lecture.
I just want to ask you one question. Who would you be if the world never gave you a label, never gave you a box to check? Would you be white, Black, Mexican, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern, Indian? No.
We would be one. We would be together, no longer living in an era of calling human beings Black people or white people.
These labels that will forever blind us from seeing a person for who they are, but instead seeing them through the judgmental, prejudicial, artificial filters of who we think they are.
And when you let an artificial label define yourself, then my friend, you have chosen smallness over greatness and minimized yourself, confined and divided yourself from others.
It is an undeniable fact that when there is division, there will be conflict, and conflict starts wars. Therefore, every war has started over labels. It's always us versus them.
So the answer to war, racism, sexism, and every other ism is so simple that every politician has missed it. It's the labels. We must rip them off.
Isn't it funny how no baby is born racist, yet every baby cries when they hear the cries of another, no matter the gender, culture, or color, proving that deep down we were meant to connect and care for each other.
That is our mission, and that is not my opinion. That is the truth in a world that has sold us fiction. Please, listen. Labels only distort our vision, which is why half of those watching this will dismiss it or feel resistance and conflicted.
But just remember, so did that caterpillar before it grew up to be its shell and became the magnificent butterfly. Well, these labels are our shells, and we must do the same thing, so we can finally spread our wings.
Human beings are not meant to be slapped with labels like groceries at supermarkets. DNA cannot be regulated by the FD. We're meant to be free.
And only until you remove them all and stop living and thinking so small
Will we be able to see ourselves and each other for who we truly are?
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful short film. I hope you all enjoyed it. I think you might have recognized some of the people in there from our debate today as well. After that, at this time, this first speaker of each side will now deliver a 3-minute summary and rebuttal speech. No new information may be introduced in the speech, and we will start with the first opposition speaker, Ronica.
All right, so it's been clear through both sides of this debate that change is very necessary, right? But the two questions we really need to ask are A, where does this change start? And B, where is this change most effective? To address the first question, we think that there's going to be no instant change, right? As side proposition has brought up and we agree on. And they brought up the example of education, which is a great starting point, but has limited impacts. Firstly, we've talked to you about the fact that it's not comprehensive enough, right? And Alazne brings up a POI about how Indigenous people still don't feel integrated despite the educational programs that are in place, right? And I've already talked about the fact that education still doesn't cover all the facets that we wanted to cover to truly represent our history. We still need to change these systems that are already like in the status quo, right? Problems in the workforce and cycles of poverty and all the other things that we brought up throughout the debate. All right, second question, where is this change most effective? We think that yes, municipal legislation is in place, but it's also a slow process, right? With like the audits and the hearings, and it also doesn't cover everything. The government doesn't have the resources to deal with all the unique facets of everything that we need to deal with. So Alazne told you about the issues with the anti-racism hearings, right? And the government just isn't going to be able to cover everything on that front. We think that change here really has to come in various forms from various systems, right? And it's not going to come only from like education and only from the like legislation and government systems that are already in place. We think it needs to be tackled on a much wider scale. Overall, we just don't think that there is enough change currently. So what has opposition told you, right? We've looked at this issue under the economic lens, right? We've talked about the racialized poverty as well as barriers in the workforce. We've looked at it under a political and legal lens, so lack of diverse representation in government, as well as certain barriers in voting, and really a lack of addressing racialized criminalization on a local and a federal level. And then we've also talked about it under a social lens, right? Talking about how discrimination is still very present and actually shockingly present in Alberta, right? And the examples that Alazne gave you only scratch the surface, right? This doesn't even take into account like all the microaggressions and subtle actions, right? She also addressed the hearing on systemic racism and demonstrated what change should and must look like. The bottom line, right, is that despite these steps that have already been put in place, it simply isn't enough, right? And we still have so much to do before Calgary becomes the city that we want it to be, right? A city that goes beyond diversity, that is truly inclusive, that is accountable, right? And really covers all the issues that we brought up today. And that's the city we want to see, right? That's the city that we're going to have to put a lot of work into creating, but that we think is worth that work, right? To make it as inclusive as it can be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronica. We will now hear the proposition final summary and rebuttal speech to be delivered by Henry.
Thank you, Chair. So I think this debate comes down to two primary central themes or ideas. You firstly have the degree to which the policy of Calgary is inclusive. You also have the degree to which the population of Calgary itself is inclusive. And you also have a large overarching idea or concept about how effective are these actual inclusivity initiatives within the city. All right, so firstly, going over to this idea of the degree to which the policy of Calgary is inclusive, we think that the government of Calgary very clearly upholds the ideas and mandates of what a government of an inclusive city wants. And these sentiments are very much so translated within their initiatives as well. My partner, Elnaz, has well proven to you that there are not only abundant forms of action taken by the city, such as the diversity, equity, and inclusion legislative strategy, but that these actions are effective in upholding the diversity and inclusive nature of Calgary, whether it be delivering actual change or acting as almost as a way to brand Calgary and to push forth and advertise the ideals of tolerance, which ultimately have a very strong resonance within their population. Much of this also shows in things like academic standards and other factors that are controlled by governments or public means, as we've already proved to you within my speech. We've disproven claims brought forth by the opposition that these efforts are fruitless by providing you evidence of change, and that even performative acts are sometimes necessary and even beneficial to push an image to the public that Calgary is inclusive, which can positively influence their own ideals and views. I think side opposition, in regards to their points, we've also disproved the notion from opposition where the incorporation of like minorities and higher degrees of inclusion is not enough. We've shown you that these initiatives are actually effective based off of the extensive evidence that is brought forth by Elnaz. We've shown you that change targeting discrimination and pushing Calgary towards a truly egalitarian society on both a macro and micro scale is happening through city initiatives that advocate for like workplace laws and also ensuring that everyone, regardless of ethnicity as well as other predetermined factors, have equal opportunity through both city and population sentiments. Nextly, when we're looking at the degree to which the population of Calgary is inclusive, we've already proven to you that the education standards within the city are strong and also beneficial in establishing a stronger collective future that is inclusive and tolerant for Calgary. Even more, opposition admits that the mechanisms of an educational system that account for future generations being inclusive aren't effective, that these are good methods to increase inclusivity in the future. My partner Elnaz has already highlighted that the progress you're seeing in an academic environment are beneficial in ensuring that future generations are inclusive and accepting. On that notion, we've heard no contentions from opposition whatsoever, except for the fact that it's just not enough, which is not true. Side opposition seems to have a large focus on this feeling of inclusivity within like the Aboriginal community, and they continue to harp on this one survey from CBC. So there's two problems at this point. This very clearly is an evidence-based point, a relatively weak one at best, since there's only one point of evidence that conflicts with other polls and clearly downplays the progress that is being made. And secondly, we've already mentioned throughout both of our speeches that you have repeated efforts from federal, provincial, and municipal sources that seek to improve these educational standards within schools, and that these have results unlike what you're being told inside opposition. Elnaz points on the Aboriginal Urban Affairs Committee show that these curriculums are not whitewashed because they're literally led by Aboriginal people. And we've talked about the benefits that have arisen from discussing these issues in depth. I think at the end of the day, if you want to go where the change is effective, you can look back at the educational point, this Aboriginal history point, which we've already discussed. I think ultimately side proposition has shown to you that not only are the initiatives and the sentiments that are shown within the populations and the city of Calgary are more than enough to consider it an inclusive city, but we are consistently moving forward. It's because of these reasons we are so proud to propose, we think that be it resolved, Calgary is an inclusive city. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we are concluding the debate. Yes. It's not necessarily a traditional debate in the sense of winners and losers here. It's really much more around, you know, being able to create that critical thinking from both sides and have that conversation. So thank you so much to all of you, the debaters, for taking the time to prepare, to discuss and debate this very important issue. We greatly appreciate your insight and ideas on the nature of our city, and I'm sure everyone here will agree with me in saying that you've given us much to consider going forward. At this time, I just want to remind the audience, I see that there's already one question in the Q&A, but if you do have any other questions for the debaters, please do put them in the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen, so you can see that. And you know, and getting back to the actual points, you know, one of the reasons I know that I was asked to moderate this is because this is my lived experience day in, day out. Not only as clearly as a person of color and a woman, also a Muslim, born and raised here in Canada, but also as the leader of a large not-for-profit that works with immigrants every single day. We see in non-COVID times 1,000 people come through our doors every single day from 8:30 in the morning to about 9 o'clock at night. So we have a large footprint in terms of working with our newest Calgarians and newest Canadians in the community. And, you know, so I'd like to, you know, really bring up some of those points. And although this was a really academic type of a debate and there were no winners and losers, you know, I think it was really important. The number of statistics and the types of information brought forward from the opposition is extremely important to pay attention to, especially as it relates to the lived experience of newcomers and of Indigenous communities, of what we often refer to as BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? And as much as most of the, you know, most of the proposition side was really focused on actual debatable, real pieces of information. You know, it's important also as we speak to and start dissecting more so, and it goes in cycles, right? I've been doing this work for 25 years now, and we've seen it come in cycles. And you know, the great hope is that with your generation, that it will not be cycles anymore, that you and all of us together will be able to move forward and be able to change a lot in terms of eliminating systemic racism. But a lot of what we could say in terms of the proposition side, you know, really be critical about your thinking about that. Now, you know, Henry and Elnaz did an excellent job, and that was their job to do that, not their specific thinking, right? But that was their absolute job to do that. But a lot of the types of debate and the logic that they brought forward can easily be put into a trope. It can easily be turned into a meme, and it can easily be used to discredit a lot of the wonderful work that is already being done, right? By saying that, oh yes, well, we're doing all these initiatives in Calgary. Well, why are we doing those initiatives? It's because we're still seeing the lived experience of people of color, of Indigenous people, of Black people being marginalized. And I think that that's an important piece as we have these conversations to continue on and to talk about. And most certainly, that's the biggest issue that we see even at the Center for Newcomers. We always like to say, just because we are an organization that works day in and day out with newcomers does not make us by default inherently anti-racist, and it does not make us by default inherently culturally competent. We have to work at that. We have to work at deconstructing the systems that are already in place that prevent newcomers from feeling safe, even in a newcomer-centric organization, okay? So with that, I would like to take us to some of the questions. I am very mindful of our time. I know we're supposed to be here till 7:30, but here's a question put forward to our debaters. And it says, I noticed that both sides use the term visible minority, which can be argued as outdated, homogenizing the experiences of different ethnic groups and reinforcing the divide between white people and everyone else. It brings up the point that beliefs of inclusion and non-inclusion are built into our language. What are your thoughts? Does anyone want to take that as a response to that? Make sure that you're unmuted when you do. Sure, Henry, go for it, please.
Yeah, I'd actually probably agree. I think things like so inclusion and this behavior of tolerance, I guess, that has recently become, thankfully, a lot more widespread within, you know, general culture. Unfortunately, a lot of the times can be like performative in nature, and I don't think a lot of people are beginning to understand that at the end of the day, things like inclusion and also ensuring that every single demographic is being represented is a far more dicey issue than a lot of people are thinking, because nowadays I think a lot of people are just seeing like moving towards, you know, cultural acceptance as splitting it into like Caucasian and then people of color. And at the end of the day, that's not inclusion, because people of color there's so many more other demographics in there. And just like you said, the fact that like within this debate as well, we unconsciously just refer to these people as visible minorities discredits the fact that at the end of the day, within this demographic, there's still even smaller sub-demographics that all have their own unique cultures, experiences, et cetera, right? So I think that's the next step moving forward. And I think it's great that there's already a lot of you know, visibility for ethnic minorities, but I think at the end of the day, distinction is going to be the next step moving forward. Distinction and acceptance, basically.
Wonderful, Henry, thank you. And arguably, I would assume that logic would also lead into this large, giant, homogenous group of white people, right? You know, when I was in the year 2000, when I was a university student, I was working at the Bridge Foundation for Youth, and a young girl from Kosovo, who's 13 years old, refugee, with blue eyes and blonde hair, came up to me and she said, Anila, why am I not white? And I thought it was just a really bad joke. And I was going to have to explain to her about, you know, that's not an acceptable kind of a joke. So I just said, but it looked like she wasn't making a joke. And I said, I don't understand what you're saying. She said, well, I've got white skin and blue eyes and blonde hair. And I said, yes. She said, so why do the other kids say I'm not white? The other white kids say I'm not white because I'm not from here. Right. And so really, I think, you know, when we talk about this group, you know, when we homogenize any group, that same can be said for multitudes of different ethnicities and different groups of people and different languages, that are all subgrouped into this big group. Yes, Alazne.
Yeah, actually, like Henry said it really, like he said it really well, but I just wanted to add to it a little bit. We did this thing at school in our social class where our teacher asked, what does an average Canadian boy look like to you? And none of us could really answer or picture anyone for like in as a way, because, you know, Canada is a country that's founded by immigrants. And if you look at who is a true Canadian in terms of history, then obviously that would go to the First Nations. Everyone is an immigrant based on timeline, but I just think that these racial biases that do exist, even with the language, as the question was asked by Richard, like I definitely think that we unconsciously or subconsciously we emulate these racial biases within our language, within our demeanor, and we don't realize that we're kind of reinforcing the cyclical system of racism, and that is a problem that we have to actively break. Like, it's not being oversensitive when you're using the right terminology. That's another thing. It's, you know, just being more conscious of what you're saying, how you're saying it, and be actively like pursuing that change.
Well, and thank you for that, because, you know, you give me a lot of hope, and I hope for the, you know, people that are my age or, you know, around that or older, that are watching today will also feel very hopeful, because I can tell you, you know, I graduated from high school almost 25 years ago, and in junior high or high school, if we would have been asked the same question, we wouldn't have been stumped. We probably would have, you know, used a very stereotypical kind of an example of what an average Canadian boy looked like. And so even visible minority or people of color or whatever, you know, terms you want to say for us. And so I think that that's a really important piece. Yes, Elnaz.
Yeah, not to extend this for too long, but I just think that's quick. Not only is there a racial divide between all of us, but there's also a cultural divide. And that's something that you can definitely see within immigrant children, saying, am I this half of my identity because I was born and raised here? Or am I this half of this identity because my parents are from here? So what is my culture? What is my race? Who am I really? Especially as someone who like looks kind of white, but has a totally different culture. But at the same time, I think it just makes our jobs and our thinking a lot easier to kind of group all of us together, which is why we end up using terms like people of color, BIPOC, because it's just so much easier for us to conceptualize these ideas and to kind of generalize them so that everyone can kind of understand. So even though it doesn't dive deeply into the details of culture and race and everything else, I think it's a great start, especially for people who are kind of new to the concept of understanding race, understanding structural racism. I think it's a great place to start, but it's kind of our responsibility to go even further and understand where these things kind of root from.
Wonderful. Yes, Ronica.
Sorry, just really quickly. First, hi, Richard. Please. It's been a while. In terms of so just to talk about the term visible minority, that's actually language that's like used within the government of Canada, right? Like they use it on StatsCan. I think in the Employment Equity Act, that's like the terminology they use, right? And like while it's easy to sort of group everything together, it also holds us back to a certain degree, right? Like Alazne mentioned with the city council hearings, right? Like you can't address the systemic racism towards like everyone encompassed within that group, right? And so like in that way, that sort of grouping together does restrict us in certain ways.
Wonderful, thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of group our final closing remarks along with the last question together to our debaters. And so, you know, I think the real takeaway for all of us here is that real change comes from an individual, you know, to begin with, and then it gets broadened into the community as being a catalyst for change. And so, you know, the question that was being asked live to you was, you know, how did you feel about taking the side that you took? And I think that was more directed at the proposition side. You know, how did you feel more about that? But also, you know, to add to that, I'd like to go around and ask each one of you, if very briefly, you know, to close this up in the next few minutes, you know, to talk maybe a little bit about, you know, how you feel about, you know, how you felt about this debate, but also, if you wanted to share a piece of advice for your fellow students, your peers, on what you can do to really affect and systemic change in your communities in Calgary. So is there anyone that would like to go first? Sure, Alazne.
Okay, so in terms of like researching for this topic, initially Ronica and I kind of freaked out at the beginning. We were like, what do we exactly say against it? Because our personal experience as immigrants within this community in Calgary has largely been positive. Obviously, there are microaggressions, and there are like, you know, racial biases that do exist. I went to a dominantly all-white junior high, and I got stared at. I did have, like, you know, jokes made about my scarf, jokes made about where I came from, but like I didn't really think about it too deeply. But I just think that one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give about the topic, and what I learned from it is just because it doesn't affect you does not mean that you shouldn't be speaking out for it. Just because you're not affected by something that's happening in other parts of the world does not mean that you cannot speak out for those victims of oppression. Does not mean that you can't stand in solidarity with them, show them that they're not alone, show them that, you know, you want to be on the right side of history, and that is super important to do. And in terms of like active change, this is something that that's why like Henry and I, we work at the Written Revolutions, because we believe that even speaking out goes a long way, and change is not impossible. We saw this with BLM protests, like, because everyone around the world, no matter what their ethnicity, no matter what their race, they stood up for George Floyd. And we saw that pressured the government, that, you know, demanded change. And even though that change is not enough, it's one step towards that. So never feel like, oh yeah, you know, I'm only one person. What is that one person gonna do? It matters. Each and every voice matters, and always speak out for others, speak out for yourself, speak out for your community.
Thank you very much, Alazne. Really wise words, especially in this time when we can really feel bogged down with our own mental health, with, you know, seeing all these devastating, atrocious things happening, and then, you know, really feeling overwhelmed. So really great advice. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Henry, please.
Yeah, so preparing for this debate was like kind of a weird roller coaster of emotions, because when I first heard the motion, I personally identified a lot more with side opposition, but I understood that generally speaking, like if you just looked at the debate head on, most of the sentiments might fall better into side proposition, and that was the impression I got at least. But then I realized the more research you were doing, I went through the same phase as Alazne and Ronica. I was like, oh, there's actually a lot of systemic problems, and a lot of these stats are kind of saying that Calgary and also Canada by extension is not as great as we think it is. And I think by that point, I was starting to really hate debating for side proposition, because also, like, I guess if we're talking about personal experiences here, I remember the first time someone told me to go back to the railroad. That was one of the first experiences I ever got where it felt like racial discrimination, and it felt like I was lower than someone else, because someone basically just compared me to what was basically a glorified like labor slave, and that doesn't feel good. And that was, I think, the first, and the worst part was, like, at the time, I didn't really understand what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. And then when I did understand what it means, it hurt even more. And that was when I started to become a lot more interested in like humanities and things like that. So I think in terms of starting with advocacy and starting with activism as a whole, I'm probably no better. I'm just as like new to this whole activist thing as anyone who might be watching this. I think the best advice I can give you, or the best advice I've ever heard, is just to use your platforms. No platform is too small, and no step forward is too small either. Even if like just using your social media pages and talking about important political and social issues that you think are important, and making those tiny steps forward to increase your platform, and also to find other mediums for you to use your voice and to speak up for the communities around the world that you think need to hear your sentiments, and also the communities that you think need to know that you support them. That's kind of just my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Henry. I absolutely agree, and I think it's such a really great you know, feedback to provide, is it doesn't really matter, you know, how much work you've done previously. We all start somewhere, and everyone's voice is extremely important in this conversation. So thank you for that. Who would like to go next?
I can go next if you'd like.
Sure, Elnaz, thank you.
Sure. Speaking for side proposition was, as Henry mentioned, like quite the roller coaster. It just kind of blew my mind doing more research into what was actually being done, that so many people have literally built careers off of solving these issues, yet we are so far from being in the place that we want to be. Exactly, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. There's so much work being done, so many people involved, so many subcommittees, committees going on with the city council, so many elected officials, hours and hours and thousands of dollars being dedicated to this, which almost makes you question like how much work is necessary to get to the point that we want to get to, and also what is the point that we want to get to, like how much inclusivity is the correct amount of inclusivity, which is why it's just so difficult. I guess my advice for people interested in this sort of thing is to kind of understand what the work is that's already being done and what's missing from it, because there's people just like Anila here that have dedicated their entire lives just answering this one question, but it's just such a difficult question. I think it actually starts with representation. Having the correct people doing the correct things is where we're going to get with inclusivity, and having the right people with the right background, the right education, putting in the work necessary and putting in their 2 cents, putting in their lived experiences is what's going to get us to correct inclusivity. But still, you know, it just amazes me that we're working so hard. But again, I kind of agree with side opposition.
Of course, Elnaz, and you know, and I think that kind of came across as well in terms of you know, you could see that kind of anguish on your guys' face a couple of times. But you know, what I really appreciated about what you've said and the advice you've given is that, you know, what is that piece? And I think about that all the time. What are the pieces that are missing? And for someone who's been doing this for as long as I have, and having mentors that have been doing it for twice as long as me, I have mentors that have been doing this for over 50 years. You know, it's consistently, who else isn't in the room? Where is that representation that needs to happen in order to find that solution that none of us have been able to find, because somebody has it and something is missing, and maybe there's some more disruption that needs to happen before things can get that put back together. So absolutely agree. Ronica, you want to close this off for us?
It's hard to follow all of that. Yeah, like Alazne mentioned, when we got this topic, it was sort of hard to start the discussion, right? Because like personally, I've grown up super sheltered, right? Like, I don't know, apart from like a couple drunk people on the train, I've never really had to experience racism, right? And I guess what I've taken from this experience is to really question everything, right? Question like the systems in place and the language that we're using to discuss these systems, right? And I think it's from examining that and being really critical of the status quo that we can see what has to be done from there. Yeah, and I think Asha might have some remarks. It looks like she wants to answer the question.
Oh no, I don't think. I think she's just co-hosting for us and putting the situation in there. But absolutely, Ronica, I think that's an extremely important piece to really, you know, and a great note to end on is, you know, even if this isn't your lived experience or not the way that we have been discussing in very blatant ways, what are the systemic pieces that are still affecting every single one of us, and how do we move forward, you know, in terms of dismantling some of that and building it back up together. So as you can see, we've shared our screen with you, and you will see all of the contact information for all of our debaters. So you can reach out to them if you want, if you have more questions, if you'd like to continue the conversation, if you'd like to learn more about what they've been doing and what they're learning. You know, I extend that out to the Center for Newcomers. All of you are always welcome to come and learn about what we're doing at the Center for Newcomers, to come and volunteer with us, participate with us. And you know, and I think that there's you know, as we've talked about tonight, there's a lot of really amazing work happening, certainly at Youth Central, in participating and having so many wonderful leaders in our community that are young people coming together and having these conversations, having these debates, coming up with new and innovative ideas that really have never been heard of before in millennia, right? There are always new ideas coming forward from our generations of young people to really try and help and solve some of the biggest problems of our generation and of our society. And that's a really hopeful piece, I think, and I hope to leave us on. But although we do have a lot of things that still need to be fixed, at least we know that there are multiple people from multiple, you know, generations and communities and groups coming together that really care about this and that are dedicating their lives to want to do that. So with that, I bid you all a wonderful, wonderful evening. And please do continue on the conversation. Excellent job to all of you, debaters, panelists. You've done amazing work. You make us all very proud to call ourselves Calgarians, because we know that we have the best youth anywhere in the world living in our city. So thank you so much to all of you. And thank you to Youth Central for hosting all of us, and to the audience for being here tonight with us. Our apologies for going a little bit over time. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.